All right, back to digestive. So where we left off in our 4 general layer plan for the alimentary canal, we're on the 4th layer. And that 4th layer can either be an adventitia or a serosa. It's the same exact thing with just one slight difference. An adventitia, that outer layer of the alimentary canal, is just simply in contact with connective tissue. However, with a serosa, that is where it's going to be covered with a peritoneum, this thin layer of mesothelial cells. And we're going to see terms like retroperitoneal, and we're going to talk about that in just a sec. But when we are adjacent to the body cavity, there's just connective tissue there holding it in place. But in other areas, the alimentary canal is suspended in the peritoneal cavity, surrounded by a peritoneum, and we're going to call this visceral peritoneum. Okay, what do those terms mean? We're pretty familiar with parietal. You remember our parietal pleura in respiratory? Where was the parietal pleura? The body wall, the rib cage in that case. In this case, the parietal peritoneum relative to your abdominal cavity, it's going to be against your body wall. So parietal is always going to be associated with the body and the muscles, whereas visceral is going to be on the internal organ, just like the visceral pleura was directly on the lungs. Instead of pleura, we just refer to it by its generic name of peritoneum. So inside the abdominal cavity, between these 2 layers, we've got the peritoneal cavity. And what did the visceral and parietal pleura do? It kept the lungs from sticking together. It kept them from having friction against each other. And it's the same thing that's going on here in our abdominal cavity between the body wall and our digestive organs. So again, very similar to what we saw with the respiratory system. With these peritoneum, we're going to see that we have organs that are completely surrounded by a visceral peritoneum, meaning they're inside this peritoneal cavity, and so we call it intraperitoneal organs. And this is going to be important in the anatomy of the abdominal cavity. Not exactly sure what this is going to look like in the lab. I don't think are y'all going to have actual specimens or still looking at models? Hadn't got there yet? Okay. Well, intraperitoneal organs that have a serosa, meaning they're surrounded by a visceral peritoneum, include the stomach, jejunum, ileum, transverse, and sigmoid colons. We'll get to exactly where these fall within our alimentary canal later in the lecture. But I want you to understand these are distinct. These intraperitoneal organs are distinct from retroperitoneal organs. What does the term retro usually mean? Backwards. If something is retro, it's kind of older, but in this case, you're going back in time. This case, we're going backwards away from the peritoneal cavity, and these organs and part of these organs are going to be directly against the body wall. Only the anterior, or the part that's toward the peritoneal cavity here, only that part's going to be covered with a peritoneum. So it's not going to be completely covered. And so we're going to see most of the duodenum, the first part of the small intestine, the pancreas, ascending and descending colon, and the rectum are going to have portions of those regions against the body wall and only partially covered with a visceral peritoneum. So it's underneath the peritoneal cavity against the body wall, and so that's why it's referred to as retroperitoneal. Here's an illustration. If you think of this yellow region, being your peritoneal cavity. We're going to have, for instance, here's the jejunum, and see how it's suspended way up here in your abdominal cavity? That is an intraperitoneal organ. And here we have the ascending colon, and you see how this mesentery that's in orange? You don't have that down here at the base, that's just body wall. So it's beneath or backward behind, whatever you want to call this. That is a retroperitoneal portion of your alimentary canal. You understand that?
How most of it is covered by the adventitia?
So you've got adventitia down here if you look at that portion. This part that's covered by the peritoneum, that would be a serosa. And since you've got that part that's adventitia, and this is beneath or back from your peritoneal cavity, then that's going to be retroperitoneal portion of your alimentary canal. And it's attached to the body wall. Hugh, did that answer your question?
No, sir.
Okay.
So the blue lines in the previous slide, are those supposed to represent the serous membrane, the peritoneum?
I think it's an attempt to. It's kind of confusing to me. Yeah. Here you can see how the stomach, that's completely covered, so that's intraperitoneal. The spleen is going to be intraperitoneal. The kidney is retroperitoneal, so it's outside of those regions.
Yes, sir.
Here you got the pancreas, retroperitoneal. So in a way it's accurate, but it's just busy. It's really, really busy to me. I like this one a whole lot better.
Okay.
Just for the basis of what it is. Now here we've got an introduction of a new term, mesentery. This is where instead of just having one layer against the body wall or one layer over an organ, you've actually got two layers that are up against each other. And that double peritoneum is referred to as a mesentery. So in this case, we have a portion of our alimentary canal that is going to be intraperitoneal, but it is actually held in place and connected by this double peritoneum or this mesentery. And this is an example of one of those. I believe this is probably going to be from a cat, from like comparative anatomy. And this is going to be your small intestine. And you can see this very thin, sort of shiny layer that has blood vessels and nerves running through it. That is just called the mesentery proper, this particular one. But you have quite a few mesenteries in your abdominal cavity that are helping to anchor a lot of your GI tract.
Is that going to be like what the blue stuff is on the...
Yeah, see the blue mesentery? And then that's just a single parietal peritoneum there. And then you've got a single visceral peritoneum on this side and on this side, but these two, it's showing a space, but they really are touching each other with a potential space between the two. Now we're going to start getting into some of the processes a little bit. But we know digestion and motility is a big part of what we're going to do. And so to know the status of our GI tract, you're going to have a lot of receptors all along the length of the GI tract. Most of these are going to be in those most internal layers adjacent to the lumen of your alimentary canal. And we're going to have a lot of chemoreceptors. These are going to be detecting pH. They're going to be detecting other chemicals in that balance in the lumen. But we're also going to have baroreceptors. What is baro? Do you remember what that term means?
Pressure.
Pressure. Think of a barometer when we hear our weather forecast. So these are pressure sensors. And basically, these pressure sensors are going to detect when your alimentary canal or a portion of your alimentary canal is filled. Because when you have material inside, it's going to be exerting pressure, pushing out on the alimentary canal, and that's going to give your central nervous system as well as alimentary canal reflexes. And we're going to get to that in a bit because we've got these ganglia in our submucosa and in our mesenteric layer and that muscularis layer. You remember those we talked about? The mesentery plexus and the submucosal plexus. Those are not necessarily going to connect to the central nervous system. They're going to be reflexes. So when this is full and you have pressure detected, it's going to go to those plexes and it's going to reflexively come back and tell your smooth muscle to do something. So it's important in determining when you've got stuff in the digestive tract. So here we kind of go again talking about this. So these reflexes that we have, again, this is going to involve central nervous system in a way because autonomic, do you remember autonomic from AMP1? Okay, subconscious, we don't have to think about it. So in this case, we've got the parasympathetic, and what is the motto for parasympathetic? Rest and digest. So this part favors digestion, and it actually slows blood going elsewhere in the body. Versus the sympathetic, and what's the sympathetic motto? You don't care if you're digesting. In fact, this shuts down the digestive system. You're not moving stuff around. Sphincters are going to close. You are closed for business. And you are going to dilate blood vessels going to your skeletal muscles and cardiac muscle, whereas the blood vessels going to your GI tract are shut down. So this is how the central nervous system affects the GI tract, but you're also going to have those plexes that we talked about, the submucosal and the mesenteric. Okay, myo, we know means what? Muscle, but we've never heard of enteric before. So in this case, enteric refers to your digestive system pathways. And in this case, a reflex. So these two plexes, the enteric nervous system, you're going to have sensory, interneurons, motor neurons. That sounds a whole lot like the central nervous system in a way, doesn't it? But in fact, they are going to cause a reflex action without utilizing the central nervous system. Because if you have material in the GI tract, then you've got to move it. You've got to move it along and you've got to eliminate it. So there's a whole lot of coordinating that goes on based on what you're detecting, principally like those baroreceptors. And you're going to move stuff along. And this is actually going to be in local regions, and that's why you have these plexes all along the length of the alimentary canal. You don't detect something going on in the alimentary canal and the whole thing become activated. You only need to activate the alimentary canal in the local region where there's stuff inside. Because the alimentary canal is very, very long. I think the small intestines are 30 feet long. You got a lot of intestines. Now we're going to introduce this concept as well, because we all know that there are two major control centers of the body. What's the number one control center in the body? Nervous system. What's the other control center in the body? Your hormones, the endocrine system. So your GI tract is no different. So we're going to introduce these hormones that are part of the control of the GI tract, but we're going to get to their particular function when we get to the organ. So here are 4 important hormones that we're going to be utilizing to control digestion, motility, and the alimentary canal. Gastrin is in the stomach. Gastric refers to stomach. That's pretty easy. Secretin, you're just going to have to remember that's in the small intestine, because I don't know how else you would put those two together. Anything chole is really going to refer to your gallbladder and bile. And gallbladder and bile enters the alimentary canal at the small intestine. And then we've got motilin. Motilin is going to be produced by the small intestine, but it's going to affect a large area of your alimentary canal. So once again, when we get to these organs, we're going to talk about these and their function. So we got central nervous system control. We got the enteric reflexive nervous system built into the alimentary canal. And we've got hormones. those are really three control centers that we're going to see helping to regulate digestion in the alimentary canal. So let's go ahead and start. You just had lunch not that long ago. And so when you start to put in raw materials that you are going to be extracting nutrients from, water, vitamins, fats, proteins, carbohydrates, it's going to first go in the oral cavity. And this is where we're going to begin our mechanical and chemical digestion. Mechanical being chewing, chemical being the enzymes and the materials in your saliva. And so in our oral cavity, the very top of the oral cavity is referred to as the palate. This is going to separate your mouth and the oral cavity from the nasal cavity. You can see the nasal cavity is up here. The oral cavity is here. And with the palate, you have adjacent to the maxilla and extending backwards, you've got this bony fragment. That's going to be your hard palate. And then in the back, you've got the soft palate that extends on downward, and that's where you're going to see that extension being the uvula. Now, the uvula, in fact, it has some sensors built into it because part of that's going to stimulate your gag reflex. If you hit that uvula, you're definitely going to start gagging, unless you can somehow consciously not. So when food gets to the back here, you're going to have to swallow or you're going to be gagging. Yeah?
What happens when people have like better gag reflexes than
I have no idea. Mine's horrible. I don't know, did I tell y'all the story about my canker sore on the uvula and I couldn't hit it because it kept jumping and dancing around? That's how bad my gag reflex is. Yeah, it's bad. All right, here's a new term. So as we look at the oral cavity and we make our way back to the pharynx, in particular, this is going to be that portion of the pharynx that's the oropharynx. We're going to go through this opening, and that is called a fauces. Just big fancy word for opening. And as we're going through that, the fauces are defined by these two folds. The first fold is going to be the soft palate, and we have another fold directly behind it. So we have the palatoglossal, all right? Palato refers to what? The palate, in this case the soft palate. Do you know what glosso refers to? Tongue, yeah. So this is going to be the more anterior, the one in front here, and you can see the uvula somewhat hanging off of that. And just behind it is the palatopharyngeal arch, and that's going to be closer to the oropharynx in that particular zone. Now, between these two arches, that's where we're going to find our tonsils, the palatine tonsils. And we've already talked in the immune system chapter what is the function of our palatine tonsils. But this is one of the entrances for pathogens, and so those are going to be part of the protective nature of the immune system. All right, so within our oral cavity, we haven't made it through the fauces yet, but in our oral cavity, we have a really important organ that's called the tongue. Now, the tongue has a lot of these projections on the surface, and these are called papillae. Some of them are keratinized, and some of these are non-keratinized. You've got taste buds on these. And for our tongue, I don't think it's as critical as for some other mammals. But how many of you own a cat? Okay? When the cat licks you, is it smooth or is it rough? It is rough. The papillae of felines is much more keratinized than ours. In fact, when you look at a lion, the papillae on their tongue, it is so keratinized that they can actually lick flesh off of a bone. And that's the purpose of these papillae. We don't necessarily have that use anymore. And so ours are much less useful for that region, but the taste buds are on those. Now, remember we got the lingual tonsils on the sides here? We also know that the tongue is attached to the floor of the oral cavity by this little strip of skin. You ever notice that thing? That is called the frenulum of the tongue, or the lingual, which also refers to tongue, frenulum. When we get to our salivary glands, we're going to see that we have some salivary glands that actually open right here on either side of the frenulum of the tongue. And some people are very talented at contracting those. And what do you call that? Gleeking, when they can squirt their saliva at you. So that's salivary gland secretion coming from those little openings there on either side of the frenulum. Now, your tongue is important for communication, but one of its primary purposes is manipulating and mixing the materials while you're chewing. It's called intraoral transport. Your tongue is comprised of 8 muscles. 4 muscles are called intrinsic. They just change the shape of a tongue and you were just doing it. Do it. Good Lord, how many folds is that? That's a bunch. Who can fold their tongue more than 3 times? Anybody?
Oh, I can.
You can?
Uh-huh. But you can do it like...
Well, you look like you're about to do a
You can
headstand.
do like this.
I've had a student one time that had 5. Okay. Who can't roll your tongue?
You can't?
Cannot. But you know it's genetic, right? Some people can and some people can't roll their tongue. Some people can't do it. But then some people, because of all those intrinsic muscles, can actually make a 5-leaf clover out of their tongue. Now, there are 4 other muscles that are attached to bones. And those are the ones that are going to help move the tongue side to side or front to back. That helps with the moving of food in the right direction to help with swallowing. Now, the lining of our oral cavity is going to be stratified squamous. Most of this is going to be non-keratinized. The only places you're going to see keratinized epithelium are our lips, which is actually a transition zone between our skin and our oral cavity. On the top part of the tongue where we have our papillae, some of those papillae that are keratinized are called filiform papillae. And then on the hard palate we have a small region, and that's because of the abrasion that's going to happen when you chew. Now, in our oral cavity, as we're moving food around, as our teeth are doing the mechanical digestion, we're going to produce and inject saliva into the material that we have in our mouth. Now, some of these are smaller intrinsic salivary glands, and they're going to be producing enzymes such as lingual. What does lingual mean? Tongue. Lipase. Remember, ASE is enzyme. So what is a lipase break apart? Fat. What's another word for fat? Lipid. Yeah, so lipase is going to be involved in lipid digestion. Now, again, these we wouldn't recognize as organs because they're just unicellular. They're really, really small. But when we get to the ones we really think about, the extrinsic salivary glands, these are in fact organs. And we can see in our illustration just over here by our ear, that is the parotid salivary gland. And it's going to produce about 25 to 30% of the saliva. It's the largest, but it doesn't do all the work. But there's one thing, and I guess this would be a dubious distinction. There's one thing that the parotid salivary gland is known for. When the parotid salivary gland becomes infected, what disease do you have? That most of you probably have gotten vaccinated against. Mumps. That's what swells up when you have the mumps, the parotid gland. Yep, the MMR. Now, another important one are the submandibular glands. You see this location here, just underneath our mandible. That one is not as large as the parotid, but it does twice the work. It's going to produce the bulk of the remainder of our saliva, the submandibular gland. And then lastly, contributing just a little bit, just inferior to, we think of it as under the tongue, that is going to be our sublingual salivary glands, maybe in the single digits as far as salivary production. So those are our three principal extrinsic salivary glands. Now, when we look at the salivary glands and we're looking at the cells that produce saliva, whenever we're looking at a gland, the cells that produce the secretions, generically these cells are called parenchyma. And so the parenchyma of our glands are either going to be the mucus type, and I think you can pretty much figure out what those cells make, right? Mucus. The mucin that when it gets hydrated becomes mucus. Or serous cells. Now, serous is not as easy to figure out. Anybody want to venture a guess what these serous cells produce? Serum. In the serum of our blood, what is one component that we have a lot of in our serum? We got a lot of water. Electrolytes. Albumin. What kind of molecule is albumin? Protein. The serous cells produce proteins and basically enzymes. Serous are said to be watery secretions, where these are fat secretions, but you're producing a lot of enzymes with our serous cells. So mucus cells, yep, they make mucin. When you wet it, it becomes mucus. And when we get to our serous cells, they are going to produce this hydrated fluid. It's going to have electrolytes in it as well, but this is the big one, an enzyme. Now, this is a weird one. ACE means an enzyme. Amy is kind of confusing. Anybody named Amy in here? Your daughter? We're not digesting your daughter. So what does this enzyme work on? Carbohydrates, in which amylose is the name of a carbohydrate. So that's what this is doing. We're producing enzymes that are going to begin the chemical breakdown of your food, particularly coming from carbohydrates. Yeah.
So is amylose like the simplest, smallest form of polysaccharide of carbs that amylase will break down?
I have no idea why they have that. It breaks down carbs, and it's just called amylase. Amylase is the enzyme. There's a carbohydrate named amylose. I'm guessing that's why it got its name. But it's going to work on, I believe it's going to work on more than just amylose. Now, in this illustration, this is the histology. I'm not sure, are y'all going to get histology in these various units in lab?
I'm sure.
Okay. So, when you look at an image like this, first, these large, round objects that have a fairly large lumen, these are going to be some of the ducts that are going to transport the saliva to your mouth. So that means we're talking exocrine because we have ducts. There's a pretty good size one, there's another one. So when you look at the difference between a serous producing group of cells, and these are going to be called, I'm totally blanking here. Good Lord. These little round jobbers. No. They're not glomeruli. Anyway, these round clusters of our parenchyma. These dark purple, and if you could look close enough, you're going to see a granular appearance. Acinus, yes, sorry, acinus. Yeah, that's just a round collection of our parenchyma. That is going to be a serous producing group of cells. However, when you see these lighter colored acini. These are going to be your mucus producing. Now, you can have, and in our illustration on the left, here you can see they've made this dark purple, kind of grainy look. That is your serous acinus, and there's the word I was looking for right there. Over here, this lighter color, that potentially is going to be a mucus acinus. You can see this one here is a mucus acinus. But the one thing they've also included is you can often have serous cells that are setting up camp on the outside of a group of mucus cells. And what's interesting is these cells make kind of a half moon shape. This almost looks like a crescent moon. And so these are referred to as a serous demilune. What does demilune mean? It's a half a moon. So this is kind of a mixed acinus or a mixed gland versus this is a serous gland, and this would just be a mucus gland.
Is that the semilune or whatever?
Possibly, I would like to see a better one than that though. No, this is salivary gland. This is a salivary gland. And your salivary glands are often defined by what percent of the parenchyma is serous versus mucus versus mixed. Here's a good example of a mucus, sort of acinus in a collection, and here you can see those demilunes. See, they're like caps on top of the mucus acini. So that's a mixed gland.
And these are just all in any of the, these are histologies of the salivary glands?
These are histology of different salivary glands. Saliva, what is produced? Well, a lot of it's going to be water, and we're going to have solutes. But it's really interesting to me. This number seems high to me. I don't think I would have ever guessed this. But every day you produce 1 liter to 1.5 liters of saliva. Does that number surprise anybody? That just seems high. I don't eat that much, but your mouth is constantly wet. And you're constantly producing some saliva because one of the things in your saliva, and I think we're going to get to it, let me see here. Yeah, is an antibacterial agent. It's called lysozyme. So it is killing bacteria that maybe enters into the oral cavity. You're also going to be washing your teeth, your tongue. This is where the chemicals that come in, they start that breakdown. Remember our amylase? And when you put food in your mouth and you begin to chew, your food kind of doesn't look like it did going in, right? Then we call this a bolus of wet, saliva-soaked, chewed up stuff. Is that good enough? Yeah, it starts to get gross at that point. Mechanical digestion in the mouth. Big fancy word, mastication. In your hand.
I was just going to ask, is there any natural diseases which cause you not to produce saliva? And if so,
Well, I would bet there are. I don't know them. I know that there are conditions where you overproduce saliva. I can't remember what that's called. Yeah.
Cancer. My uncle got cancer and couldn't produce saliva.
So, big fancy word for chewing, mastication. This is where we're chewing our food, we're mashing it up. And what's the purpose of mechanically chewing apart your food? Well, you're not going to swallow a whole Big Mac. I mean, you're not going to do that. You might try, but you'll just do it once. But what you're doing as you break up the material, you're increasing the available surface area for the acid and the enzymes to work so that it can be digested more quickly. So as you chew, you're going to have more saliva produced. What's a great example of that?
Gum.
Anybody want to admit you're addicted to gum? I am super addicted to gum. You know you're not going to eat it. But I always wonder, you don't think about chewing gum, right? But you don't swallow it involuntarily. How does that work? Because if I put Easter candy in my mouth, it's gone. I'm not even going to think about swallowing, I'm going to swallow it. So, but chewing gum definitely promotes salivation. Now again, unconsciously controlled in our medulla, in the pons, right, in the brainstem. This is referred to as the mastication center that's going to control those activities, including swallowing. And sometimes it doesn't work right. And when it doesn't, that's when you crunch your tongue. And that's no fun. No fun whatsoever. Your teeth. We call it dentition. All of your teeth together. And those are the hard bits that are involved in chewing, mastication. Now, are your teeth the same as bones? No, they're not. For one thing, your bones are living tissue. But the enamel of your tooth that is hard like bone, it's made of calcium phosphate like bone, it's not living tissue. You have to get down into the roots of the tooth where you have the nerves and the blood vessels. And that's why you can begin to erode the enamel of your tooth with a cavity a long time until it breaks through down to the nerve and lets you know this is not good. All right, so it's similar but different than bone. But where you do have an encounter with bone are these sockets down into either your maxilla or your mandible, and these are called dental alveoli, or the sockets. These are the things, if you have your wisdom teeth removed and you run into this condition afterward called a dry socket, it's no fun if that happens. That's what they're talking about. These areas where the roots of those teeth fit down into the bone. Now, your teeth are held in place by connective tissue that is called this periodontal ligament. You can see it down here, and you even have this material called cementin that helps to hold the tooth and the root of the tooth to the bone itself. And once you begin to have gum disease and all this starts to separate, then the teeth get loose and stuff starts falling out. It's not a good thing. So make sure to brush your teeth. At least twice a day, right?
So that periodontal ligament, is that present in baby teeth?
So not to an appreciable degree, because you got me right to the next slide here. Your first teeth, your baby teeth, are going to come out. They have to come out. And they're called deciduous teeth. And you have about 20 of them. And so you're going to have 4 quadrants of teeth, if you will. You're going to have a quadrant on the right and left, and the upper teeth on the right and left of your lower teeth. And so you're going to have 2 incisors, a canine, and 2 molars in each quadrant. Now that's your baby teeth, your deciduous teeth. Your permanent teeth, you're going to have 32 of them. Now these 32 teeth, you're going to have these third molars, which many of us hate, the wisdom teeth. And again, with this in each quadrant, you're going to have 2 incisors, a canine, 2 premolars, and 3 molars. And that's going to complete your adult dentition. And once you've got these 32 teeth, you're not going to get more unless they're artificial. So you got to take care of your teeth. Yeah.
Can't you have extra teeth in your jaw? Like extra adult?
You can. It's not highly unusual, but you can have additional teeth. In fact, I had 5 wisdom teeth. Now one was little, it almost looked like a baby tooth that didn't quite finish developing or whatever, but I tell my family that's why I'm so smart, right? 5. Yeah, that's the response I get from them too, especially my children. All right, we have mechanically masticated our food. We have added the chemical of the saliva, which has got the amylase in it. Now we got to get it in the right tube. Have you ever gotten your food in the wrong tube? Yes, it happens a lot. So we hit the pharynx. Okay, the first is going to be that oropharynx in the back. And so here we're going to have the same type of epithelium, non-keratinized. It's going to be slick. It's going to help it go the right place. And the right place is the esophagus. Now, as we get into that zone of the pharynx and the larynx, remember we've got two streets we can go down, right? The esophagus, or what's the other one? The trachea. We don't want food going down the trachea. And they are pretty much side by side. Now, fortunately, we've got this flap that is going to help direct traffic. Have you seen the, what do you call the railroad tracks where you flip the arm down and you change from one track to the next?
Yes, sir.
I forget exactly what that's called, but this is kind of that little changeover. What do we call that? The epiglottis. That is going to direct the food into the esophagus and protect it from going into the trachea. So when you look at the esophagus, and we have a histological slide coming up in just a bit, it looks somewhat of a collapsed passageway. It's not going to be nice and round like our trachea. Our trachea is opened by those cartilaginous rings. The esophagus doesn't have that same support. Why would the esophagus look collapsed? The smooth muscle can contract or expand.
Keeping stomach acid in.
Well, here's the thing. It's collapsed because it's empty. It has to be able to expand like your stomach based on what you're swallowing. So once we get into the esophagus, we start to go down, and the esophagus passes through the diaphragm. Did you realize that? The esophagus passes through the diaphragm because the stomach is below the diaphragm. So there is a hole in the diaphragm, and a hiatus means hole. And so the hole in your diaphragm that the esophagus passes through is your esophageal hiatus. Have you ever heard the word hiatus before? When have you heard that word?
When you stop drinking.
Like in a clinical situation. Have you ever heard of hiatal? Hiatal hernia? Anyone ever heard of a hiatal hernia?
Yes.
So a hiatal hernia is where your stomach herniates up through the hiatus of the esophagus and herniates up into your... You did? And that is one of the leading causes of acid reflux disease, because the muscle surrounding the esophagus at this point supports what we're going to see as the lower esophageal sphincter. So here's our trachea, nice and round. You can see our tracheal cartilage ring. What is our muscle right there between those cartilage arms? This is a respiratory chapter.
It's smooth muscle.
What's its name? Trachealis muscle. All right. Now, what is this stuff out here that looks like big swimming pools? That's got the TH. Huh? Thyroid. That is the esophagus. Do you see how it's collapsed? It's not just a big round lumen. If you were to catch this in mid-swallow with all your food inside, you would see it then stretched out. All right. Regulating passages of food. You remember we talked about that muscularis layer? When it gets expanded in some regions, we call them sphincters. They're somewhat of the control gates. So with our esophagus, we have a superior esophageal sphincter. That's up here at the top. So this is going to close when we inhale. We don't necessarily want a lot of air in our esophagus. But this one, the inferior or the lower esophageal sphincter, this is the one that I was talking about that is surrounded by the diaphragm. And when you herniate the stomach up through there, then you compromise that sphincter, which this one is not regulating food getting to the stomach. This sphincter is keeping the acid in your stomach from coming back up into the esophagus. The lining of your stomach protects itself from the acid. You don't have that same protection in your esophagus. Has anyone ever had heartburn? You may not have called it heartburn, but have you ever kind of burped up stuff and it just burns all along your throat? That's heartburn. And when it's bad lower in your body, because remember, here's your diaphragm. Your esophagus is right here, that hiatus. What also sits right here? Your heart. Heartburn has nothing to do with your heart except it's happening in the same kind of location.
What causes the stomach to come through the diaphragm like that?
It can be if you have chronic acid reflux, then the esophagus is going to swell. And then when it resolves, it'll contract. And if you keep doing that, it's like putting on your underwear over and over and over. That elastic waistband just is gone. So that hole just keeps getting compromised until it's so large, and the pressure of breathing, the pressure of just contracting your abdominal cavity, it just pushes the stomach up. You ever think you'd have to learn about swallowing? I mean, we do it instinctively and involuntarily. Well, swallowing has a voluntary phase. Now again, it can be under subconscious control like with our saliva, but when we eat, we initiate the swallowing process consciously. Now, the bolus that we have turned our food into with the mechanical digestion in our saliva, that's going to move backwards. And once that bolus gets in the area of the pharynx, that's when we are going to start this involuntary reflex that our enteric nervous system takes over to, and that's where we begin the process of peristalsis and moving this material down the esophagus. Now, this reflex is also going to be controlled in the medulla. Again, this is your brainstem, so this is autonomic. It's not consciously controlled. Basically, you're going to sense that in our fauces, in that hole there, right before we get to the oropharynx, then we need to start to swallow. Yeah, hang on, Hugh.
How come when you swallow, like, that isn't like clear and you
There must be some sort of disengaging of that gag reflex when you swallow. Otherwise, we'd never be able to eat.
I think it goes up, doesn't it? Doesn't your
It gets
uvula,
out of the
like, go
way a
up?
lot of the times. Yeah. Hugh?
Did you say what the bolus is?
It's your food.
The bolus is your chewed up food. Chewed up, saliva-rich stuff that's in your mouth. Oh, yeah, here. So see, the soft palate and uvula, they unblock the passage. And they're also somewhat protecting the nasopharynx because they just kind of go up and out of the way. Now, here's the epiglottis. We already talked about this. It's going to make a ramp over the glottis, which is the laryngeal opening, and it's going to make a ramp so the food slides down and directly enters into the esophagus. Also, because we're not babies anymore, then we're going to stop breathing. Versus babies, they can breathe and drink the milk all at the same time, which is pretty much magic to me. I don't know. After the pharyngeal phase, now we're in the esophagus. Understand, as we go further down the esophagus, we are switching from skeletal muscle, which really is that upper part of the voluntary swallowing process. As we move further and further down, we're shifting from skeletal muscle dominating to smooth muscle dominating. So what does that tell you? You can initiate a swallow, but can you stop it? No. If you ever tried to stop a swallow mid-swallow, it's not pretty. Okay? Swallow's going to happen. So once we're in the esophagus, this is where we're going to start those wave-like muscular contractions of peristalsis as we move toward the stomach. And it's not going to stop until we get in the stomach. Yeah.
What causes food to get stuck in the esophagus? Like, does the esophagus like lose its elasticity, or?
So I believe this is going to be somewhat of an aberrant reflex. My father also had a problem with this. My wife has a problem with this. And so there comes a time that the food gets stuck. And so what will often have to happen is you just have to wait, and sometimes the peristalsis will slowly move that food down. Or oftentimes it goes in reverse and you got to get it out.
So like when you swallow a pill, you can feel it like.
Sometimes I've never had that before. I basically can just put a whole bunch of pills in my hand and just and it's gone. Yeah, I don't know if that's a learned thing or not. Hang on a second. Yeah. Correct. So you're not even thinking about all this, and you really can't reverse it unless it gets stuck, and then your body goes, this doesn't belong here, and then it just shifts into reverse, and you got to get to a bathroom quick. Now, if you do have that problem of swallowing, then you're going to have to go get your esophagus stretched, and you're going to have to be very careful about not eating too much too fast. Really dense foods are problems. Steak is a problem. Breads can be a problem as well. I think they get pretty dense depending on how fast you eat them. So
If we go to like a restaurant, it's like a steak restaurant or something, he has to go like to the bathroom like once or twice.
Mm-hmm.
Oh my gosh.
That's pretty much it.
He just has to get the food down or up.
Yep.
Sucks. Yeah, it's very.
Smaller bites.
All right. So our bolus made it to the stomach. Now, what happens in the stomach? Chemical or mechanical digestion? Both. That was a trick question. Yeah, both. You saw chemical and you went for it, didn't you? So in the stomach, we are going to continue both chemical and mechanical digestion, because your stomach has not only a longitudinal layer and a circular layer, just like we saw in our general 4-layer system, but it's also got an oblique layer. So your stomach can really mix and churn the food. When your stomach is empty and these muscles churn, what do we call that?
Growling.
Your stomach growling. Why does it make sound? Because air is getting moved around in your stomach. Yeah, air gets in your stomach when it's empty. Not a lot, but some. Now, that bolus that was in the esophagus, when it's in the stomach and you add the additional enzymes and hydrochloric acid, now we call that the chyme. And the chyme can remain in your stomach anywhere from 2 to 6 hours. And you've got a sphincter at the bottom of the stomach that's going to control the passage from the stomach to the small intestine. So when your stomach is filled with food, that sphincter is going to close and keep that material in the stomach longer, so it's being processed. This is why before you go out Thursday night, what do you need to do before you go out? You got to eat. The way this works is when you have a full stomach and you close off that sphincter, the alcohol doesn't get to your intestine as quickly, and so it doesn't get into your bloodstream as quickly. If you go out on an empty stomach and you start knocking these things down, you're going to be in a world of hurt, and you're going to be in the bathroom, not because you got choked, but for different reasons, right? All right, the stomach looks like a pretty simple thing, right? Well, we've got different regions. So at the very beginning where the esophagus attaches, we refer to that as the cardia of the stomach, which is interesting because cardia usually refers to what? The heart. This is going to be in the same general vicinity, below where the heart sits. That's all I can think of why they named that. You're going to have this lower esophageal sphincter. I don't like this cardiac sphincter. Lower esophageal, inferior esophageal sphincter. These are all names for that same thing. Then we got the hunchback of Notre Dame up here. See that hump? That's the fundus of the stomach. And then the rest of the stomach is the body, and we finish off down here with the tail that is called the pylorus. The pylorus. Here at the pylorus, it's going to make a funnel. All of this material is getting funneled down here before we connect with the small intestine. And we have a hole, this opening, that allows the chyme to pass from the stomach to the small intestine. And you see that little pinched off part right there? That is the pyloric sphincter. When you've got food in your stomach, that's shut down for business until various sensors say, you know what, it's time to move on, in which case that pyloric sphincter will begin to open up and it will allow that material to move into your intestine to be further processed. Now, you know the esophagus was collapsed and looked kind of folded up? That's because it was empty. Your empty stomach has all of these folds and ridges inside when it's empty, and those are often referred to as gastric rugae. Because when your stomach is empty, it's much smaller, and I forget, but your stomach can hold a huge amount of material. And if you don't believe that, just watch the hot dog eating contest. Is it July 4th? Is that when it is? July 4th? And Joey Chestnut, was it eating like? I don't know, but these, don't try it at home. Okay, these are professionals and crazy people, so.